Hello, I'm really sorry that I can't be there at what seems like a very important and interesting conference, but I'm very grateful to the organizers for having invited me in the first place and for allowing me this sort of mechanism for presenting my paper. I'm going to be talking about this idea of symbols as flows of energy. And as usual, I'm going to be very much dependent on the work that I have been doing at Çatalhöyük, which is a 7th millennium site in central Anatolia. It's in a way an interesting time to be talking about the archaeology of symbols, because there has been quite a sea change in the way that we have been thinking theoretically about symbols, and particularly over the last 20 years. When I wrote Symbols in Action, the focus was very much on the things on the left-hand side of this slide. So things to do with human agency. It was all about the way humans used material culture in an active way in order to have some sort of social impact. And so the issue was very much about how symbols represent what they're trying to tell us, rather like words in a book, the idea of the textual metaphor. And there was a very clear sense of a subject and object division, that humans, used objects in order to symbolize whatever they wanted. And the method that was being used was very much interpretive. So the focus was on how do you interpret these text-like things, and very much influenced by hermeneutics. So the question of context was very clear. In the more recent theoretical discussions, which often are called the new materiality or the ontological turn, the focus is less on symbols and how they represent, and more on things and their agency. So rather than focusing on the agency of humans, looking at the agency of things, various types of thing agency. And so rather than looking at what something represents, the focus has turned to what something is, to its being, or to its thingness, very much influenced very often by Heidegger. This has led to a focus on post-humanism, where there is less of a centering of the human and more of a focus on humans and things, humans and symbols as being at the same sort of level, and allowing for different sorts of ontologies, where different approaches to the material, to things, are allowed. Different senses of reality are thought to be observable in the archaeological record. So it's less about interpreting, it's claimed, and more about getting at ontological differences. And one way of doing that is by looking at assemblages. So there has been this shift, and what I want to do today is to use Çatalhöyük to try and explore some of these changes, and partly to critique them and to say that there are some things here that need changing. So I want to start by giving some examples of how one might look at something both from an interpretive, representational point of view and from a thingness or ontological point of view. So if we look here at Çatalhöyük at these pairs of bull's horns that are placed around a platform, you can of course say that the bull's horns just represent bulls, so they're symbols of bulls, and that's straightforward. Or one can try and say that they don't just represent, but they actually are the vitality, the power of the bull. So we've had quite a few anthropologists who come to work with us at Çatalhöyük, and people like Maurice Bloch say that what's going on here is that the bull's horns are being used to revitalize the house, to recharge it with energy. So another example might be the fact that at Çatalhöyük there is often evidence for the recirculation or circulation of body parts. And in the bottom right here, you can see a plastered skull that is being held in the arms of a woman. And again, you can just say, okay, well, so the skull represents the ancestor, represents the dead person. It's just a representation. Or one can argue that some way this skull has some existing power, that it's still seen as alive and vital and playing a part in the community. Similarly with the figurines at Çatalhöyük. So if we take this figure in the middle, for example, we can say, okay, well, yes, that represents a woman, although in fact there are no genitalia shown, and so it could be a male sumo wrestler type of figure. But nevertheless, one can talk about it in those sorts of terms as representing a woman or a man. Or one can try and say that in some way these images have some sort of vitality or power in their own right. So how does one try to sort out this? How does one try to distinguish the representational view from the ontological view? Well, in my view, the main answer is through context. In a lot of the recent theoretical literature, there is an attempt to shift away from context and talk more about relationality. In my view, this is somewhat of a sleight of hand, and that relationality is really the same as contextual analysis. And certainly at Çatalhöyük, it is the context that helps us work out, or try to work out, whether these objects have something beyond just representational imagery. So in this case, the image that we saw before in the bottom left there is shown how, as it was recovered, and it was covered in a sort of casing of gypsum, and associated with it was galena and blue beads and red ochre, and this was all placed on the floor of a building in a very intentional way, and it suggests some bundle of meaningful artifacts that are having some power in the house, perhaps in abandoning the house or in founding a new floor as the house was rebuilt, having some sort of functional role in that way, a powerful object in its own right. And if we go back to the question of how do we know whether the skull in the bottom right is representation of the dead, or whether it actually is the dead and is powerful in some way, the context for this is that there's much evidence at Çatalhöyük for delayed burial. That is, that people were not immediately buried, but were treated in various ways and kept around for quite a long period of time. And body parts, not only skulls, but other body parts or large sections of bodies were kept, perhaps smoked, perhaps dried in various ways and kept for a long time before being deposited, suggesting that the dead had a continued presence in society. They weren't put away, buried away, but continued to live on in some way in life. And finally, to return to the question of the representation of bull's horns, does this just represent bulls and so on, or does it have some sort of vital force or power, as people like Maurice Bloch have suggested? Well, part of this is context, that this particular platform, which is surrounded by these bull's horns, is a very, very important platform in this house. There were lots and lots of burials found beneath the floor, and you can see there are other symbols, bucrania, on the wall and niches. And when we took off some of these layers of plaster, we found lots of evidence of painting. So it's a very important space and was continually replastered and redone. There were many, many layers of red paint on these pedestals. And this sort of recalls what Mellart found in the 1960s at Çatalhöyük, this continual replastering and repainting of bulls' heads, suggesting that they had some continued significance or vitality in the life of the house. So what I've suggested so far is that one can try to move from representational arguments to ontological arguments by using contextual information. And I want to try and give you another example, looking at this particular building, which has the normal layout at Çatalhöyük of hearths and ovens in the south part of the house, and you move northwards to the platforms on the north and the east, under which people are buried. And by this platform, you may just be able to see some sort of painting, a geometric painting on the wall. And we find a large number of these geometric paintings. So the question is, does this painting just represent something, or is there more to it than that? So in terms of representation, we certainly call it a brick painting, because it looks as if these designs are rather like bricks. But we have no evidence that they really refer to bricks. And we have conducted a whole series of semiotic analyses, if you like, looking at these sorts of paintings and looking at similarities and differences between them. So we can talk a lot about the style and so on, and how motifs were used. So we can talk quite a lot about the grammar, if you like, even though we may not really be able to say what it represents. We're in a way more successful with phenomenology, because we can say a lot about what it was like to live in these houses. Work by Gesualdo Busacca, for example, has done a lot of work on the lighting and the smoke and the smells and so on in the house. And it gives us a sense of how difficult or easy it must have been to see these paintings in these often quite dark buildings. We can also talk about where they're placed and how, as you moved around the house, you might come upon them or see them from different angles. So this is all a sort of phenomenological approach. That sort of spatial approach is also possible to try and get towards an ontology using context. Here, what Gesualdo Busacca has done is show the frequencies of paintings above different platforms in the houses. So this is looking at many houses and trying to look to see where the paintings occur. And you can see that the paintings tend to occur along the northern platforms and the eastern platforms. And what's of great interest is that it's those same platforms where you get burial in that period. So for example, here we're looking at the number of burials along the north and the east platform, and they're much higher than the ones in the central and west and so on. So this suggests that there is some spatial correlation between the paintings and burial. And we've also found evidence of temporal continuity, that there is some evidence that when the paintings occur is when the burials were occurring. So there's some special relationship between these paintings and the dead. And that suggests that they are, again, having some sort of active role. They're allowing us to communicate with the dead, or perhaps be engaged with them in some other way. We can also see that there was lots of performative aspects to these paintings. You can see they have these vertical uprights, but at times the vertical uprights are missing, as if there was some sort of cloth or other type of thing that was here. And we also find that there is much evidence that these paintings, or this painting, was replastered and renewed and changed over time, still trying to keep the same design, but continuing the same location. So there seems to be some active, engaged relationship with the dead through these paintings, suggesting that they have some special vital significance. I want to try to move now a little bit away from the question of simply how does one try to get at ontological questions, and move more to the question of temporality. I want to argue that in much of the new work on relationality and new materiality and so on, there is insufficient attention paid to time. Çatalhöyük allows us to do this very effectively because we can see the multiple layers of paintings on, the multiple layers of plasterings of white plaster on the walls and on the floors of the buildings. And here you can see, for example, the multiple layers in a cross section through a house floor. You can see the multiple floor layers going over a bench and how some of these layers are associated with burial. So this is how one tries to make a link between the burials and the paintings that occur on the walls of these houses. The work by Gesualdo Busacca has shown a remarkable series of these sort of replasterings. You can see these, sometimes there are 250 layers of plastering on the wall. These are probably happening weekly or monthly, very frequent replasterings. And one of the most clear results of Gesualdo's work is that there are clusterings of the paintings. They seem to occur in periodic groupings, and then for there to be no painting for a long period of time, and another clustering of grouping of paintings occurring. We can see this in a number of different sorts of ways. Sometimes paintings and sculptures, relief sculptures, repeat from one building to another. So this is an example of one building in the bottom left here, where you have pairs of leopards, and then exactly above that, in the building above it, you get this same pairing found. And this suggests perhaps that the repetition of symbols is somehow recreating or renewing the vitality that was found before. That by copying something, one renews, recreates a vitality. And this is also true within any one particular house. If you look at this pair of leopards here, we see that there's lots of evidence of repainting using different types of spots through time, sort of revitalizing in much the same way that we saw earlier, revitalizing the relief sculptures by repainting them, recreating their essence or their power. So if we return to the bull's horns that we saw earlier, as I said before, these are multiply repainted. And we see in the work that Mellart did, as I showed you before, this repetition. And I'm arguing that the repetition, the continuity, is particularly when it's in these episodic groupings, is a way of revitalizing and continuing the power of the bull's horns or of the paintings. This idea that we need to understand symbols, items, objects in series is one that has been developed, I think, quite effectively by Alfred Gell. He talks about it as retention and protension. And what he's showing here is the oeuvre of the work of Marcel Duchamp, and arguing that any particular artwork produced by Duchamp refers both backwards and forwards. That this sculpture, whatever it is, painting, refers backwards but also forwards, and this one refers backwards and forwards. So there's retention and protension in series. He also looks at the Maori houses, the meeting houses, which are full of symbolism, and looks at them through time and shows how they use similarity and difference in order to create a series of meeting houses over time. And so what I'm arguing is that these types of series are not just people copying, but they're also people trying to retain the power, the success, the prestige of an earlier object and taking it on through time. So that when you come to sequences of pottery at Çatalhöyük, you see enormous similarity through time, but slight differences as things change. And there are these waves of periodic concentrations on certain styles, certain forms that come in and go out and then come back in again in these sort of flows, these waves of similarity and reference backwards and forwards. Similarly with the figurines, what we're looking at here, work by Kari Nakamura, has looked at the shift from the middle to the late to the final phases through time, and looking at how similarities and differences are constructed. And again, you get these sequences through time of particular types, but also these waves of forms that come in and go out. And of course, archaeologists are used to this idea that there are sort of battleship type curves of styles that come in and out. And what I'm pointing out is two things really. One is that one can't understand the frequency of a particular type just in relation to other types at that time period, but one also has to look at the trends through time, the revitalization and the decay, where one is on that process in these series. And so the other thing that I'm arguing is that these are not just sequences of types, that these are energies or forms of continuity in the success or power or prestige, or energies or vitalities that flow through time, vitalities that expand and decay through time. So in summary, I want to argue that much recent work on the relational does not pay enough attention to time. Repetition is a way of capturing and renewing energy or vitality, whether that energy is functional or spiritual or whatever it is. Pots and things and symbols cannot be understood in their present without reference to their past and future, to the flows of energy that flow through them. Sequences of pots or series of pots, things, and symbols are pulses of energy within flows. But in fact, it is not the symbols that have energy. Rather, it is the forces that flow through them. These forces of prestige or power or ancestry. So things do not have energy, but they channel and instantiate the energies. Things do not themselves have agency, whether it is power or prestige or desire, but they bring agency into being. And I'd like to finish then with this quote from Alfred North Whitehead, a philosopher who applied many ideas from the electromagnetic field to our relationship with the world. And one of the quotes from him is that an actual entity is a process and is not describable in terms of the morphology of a stuff. And really what I've been saying is that we can't really talk about a thing as a symbol, as an entity in its own right, without trying to describe it in relation to the strings of continuity that come before and after it. That is the process. So in the end, thank you again, and thank you to all the team members that have played such an important part in everything that I have been talking about.